Hey, welcome, and Felcha. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim, where I give you my random thoughts as well as some stories and historical information and some yarns and whatever tweaks my interest for the week. I'm your host, David McDonnell, and this is whatever this is. This is the 20th day of September. One of these days I'll have a countdown. How many days into the pandemic we're in? Like they used to have in the news, day 20, day 500, day 600 of some major event, and here we are, well into the pandemic, and I'm still doing this podcast because I cannot do a live show without endangering myself and whoever happens to be at the show. But that's the world we live in. So today, what I wanted to talk to you about is a current event, which I'm going to then segue into an historical incident, historical events, which are true stories. Actually, the current event and the historical event are true, which is not always the case with my podcast. But the current event I wanted to talk to you about is the separation of children from their parents, which is happening along the United States border. Now, this was originally a pilot project started in 2017. It later became the official policy that anyone who enters the United States without permission, including those seeking asylum, are imprisoned while awaiting prosecution. Now, if they arrive with children, those under 18, the children are handed over to the Department of Health and Human Services, and they're shipped to one of 100-odd refugee settlement centers. So the children are set miles away from their parents, and really, it turns out, without any sort of tracking system for the eventual reuniting of the parent and child. Now, we've seen photos of this with children in cages, many cases of abuses, either sexual abuse or physical abuse, and certainly all these children have been traumatized. And thousands of children have been separated from their parents. We don't even know how many because the government has not been at all transparent in this, and sometimes even violating court orders in this regard. But whatever the number is, it's a lot. And it's continuing today in the face of yet another risk. And I'm speaking, of course, of the coronavirus. And I don't know what is happening to these kids in these refugee centers in the face of the virus. Now, we don't hear much about this anymore. It's not quite in the news, and even though it's been going on for 4 years, its newsworthiness has been replaced by some other obvious things, like the virus, and like the fact that the western third of our country is now on fire. And with so many things going on in the world today, so many bad things going on in the world today, it's kind of hard to remain concerned with a few thousand children from Guatemala or from wherever who are in detention centers in Texas and other southern border states. But anyway, it's our problem, and we are responsible. And when I say we, because Americans cannot say that he did it or they did it. It's our government policy. It's our government. So we have to own it, and we have to come up with a solution. And that leads me into a potential solution that I have for you. And I believe it'll work, at least for the females that are in captivity, the female children that are in captivity. And here it is. I think first we take the teenage girls, the mid-teens, early teens, those under 18, obviously, that are in captivity at the border. And we take them out of these detention centers and we put them in another facility, a facility devoted to this program. And there are some empty prisons at various places, and there's certainly for-profit prison companies. And I'm sure one of them would be love to have another lucrative contract to house these girls. Now, at this facility, we do a couple of things. First of all, we teach these girls English. Now, the kids at this detention center, I don't know what their level of English is. I'm sure it ranges from fluent to non-existent. But we at least teach them as much as we can about the English language. Then we teach them the domestic arts, basic household cleaning, laundry, kitchen sanitation, cooking, other typical household chores. All of the things that many men expect a housewife to do. And then once the training is complete, we send those girls to some place within the country and where the men outnumber the women. Now, there are many such places. Statewide, there are significantly more men than women in North Dakota and Wyoming and Alaska. And there are other states where men slightly outnumber women. And certainly in all 50 states, there are regions within those states where men outnumber women. I'm not sure why, and I'm not even going to pretend to know why or hypothesize why. It just is. Now, those men in those states, with so much fewer women, are certainly looking for wives. And if they're not looking for a wife, they're certainly looking for someone who will do the kinds of things that a wife would do. And so once we get these girls in the detention centers, refugee centers along the border, once we get them to these places, we'll have a job fair. Truth be told, it might be more like a meat market than a job fair, but we'll call it a job fair. And the men, either looking for a wife or looking for someone to do the household chores, could come in, inspect the girls, and choose one of them to come live with them. Now just think what this does. It allows the girls to stay in America, and it gives them a job. And the men would acquire a housekeeper, and maybe even a wife. And the all Americans, would be relieved of the embarrassment of keeping these children in cages and facilities along the border. And United States taxpayers would be relieved of the expense of housing and feeding these kids that we've separated from the parents. Now, that's just an idea. Now, I hope you realize that it is a terrible idea. It's ridiculous, frankly. And it does, in fact, treat young girls like meat. And I have a confession to make. This was not my idea. And I have a vivid imagination, but never would I have ever dreamed up a scheme like this. But someone else did. And the someone else are British officials trying to find a solution to the growing number of Irish orphans in 1848. Now, 1845 to 1850 are the years that the Irish call the Great Hunger, An Gorta Mór. Americans usually refer to these years as the potato famine, which is actually a misleading name. Maybe that'll be a subject of another podcast. But those were the years in which over 1 million, probably over 1.5 million, Irish died from starvation and for starvation-related diseases. And there was also the years in which an equal number, at least 1.5 million, probably more, left Ireland. Most of them ended up bound for the United States or Canada. As you might imagine, the calamity that this was caused the creation of a lot of orphans. Now, there were few orphanages in Ireland, but they were soon overwhelmed. Orphans in any culture, any society, typically move in with other relatives. But the other relatives of these kids, many of them, had also died or also left Ireland. And most of the rural Irish lived in extended family households anyway, already. The typical family was 10, 12 people. And by that I don't mean that the Irish were prolific in childbearing, but rather they were extended families. You had a one-room hovel in rural Ireland. And if you were a child living there, you lived with your siblings, and you lived with your parents, and you probably lived with your grandparents. You may have lived with an aunt and an uncle and your cousins. And they all lived together in this one-room abode because they had nowhere else to live. So if the calamity struck, if starvation struck, if typhus struck, it struck the whole household, and you lost your extended family. So there was no other place for these kids to go. Now, most of these orphans ended up in the workhouses. Now, the workhouses were an English system. It was designed to deal with the English poor. And the concept was transplanted by the British to Ireland. And the notion simply was that public assistance, help to the poor, starving, should not be available unless people voluntarily admitted themselves to a workhouse and performed work. Now, once they did, in exchange for the work, they would get housing and be fed. Now, these workhouses were dismal, abysmal places, but that was intentionally so. The theory was if the facility was better than what was available to the ordinary laborer, then why be an ordinary laborer? Move into the workhouse. And of course, the conditions for ordinary laborers in Ireland was terrible. So certainly the conditions in the workhouses were as well. Now, they had separate dormitories for men and for women and children. So families were split up. Many of these facilities had a fourth wing for idiots. That was the phrase they used for anybody who had a mental illness or was otherwise impaired. But the biggest problem during the famine years, during the Great Hunger, with these workhouses was typhus. Now, typhus is one of those diseases which flourishes during a famine. Why, I may tell you that in another podcast, but I haven't got time today. But the problem was, if someone entered a workhouse with typhus, it wasn't long before everyone in the facility had typhus. Very communicable, very contagious. So these workhouses became typhus factories, and they were, during the famine years, filled to capacity. And no one could be admitted and thus fed until someone else vacated, which meant till someone else died and created a vacancy. And such deaths happened regularly. About 1 in every 4 people who was admitted to a workhouse during the Hunger Years never got out alive. It was about 300,000 people. And about 140,000 of those that died in the workhouses of Ireland were children. Most workhouses had mass grave in the back, and thus poor and hungry would come in the front door. They'd be admitted to the workhouse. They would do some work for a while, but then they'd get sick, and then they would die, and then we'd go out the back door, be carried out the back door, and be buried in a mass grave. And then once in the mass grave, that would create a vacancy for someone else to come in. Now, some of these workhouses still exist in Ireland. They're not, fortunately, workhouses any longer. I took a tour of the one in Swinford a few years back. The old Swinford workhouse is now an administration building for the adjacent Swinford Hospital. Now, behind this administration building, the old workhouse, is a large mound, which was a mass grave for those who died in the workhouse during the hunger. And the grave was kept open during the entire hunger, this entire 3, 4, 5-year period. Because people were dying so fast, it didn't make sense to cover up the dead. And they didn't bother doing that until the Hunger Years had ended. Now, the British didn't have much response to this. The workhouse was really the only acceptable plan they had for dealing with starving children. And British officials recognized that children were dying, but they took no other responsibility. The official policy was there was nothing else they could do for these orphans. And the unofficial policy was that workhouses were not supposed to be nice. And well, sometimes shit happens. Now, not all of the children at the workhouses were orphans in the biological sense, but they were considered orphans. And that's because once a family entered a workhouse, the men were sent to the men's dormitory, the women to the women's, and the children to a children's area. And the workhouses did not maintain the family unit. In fact, fraternization was prohibited. The men were prohibited from having any contact with the women, including their wife. And the mother and father were prohibited from having any contact with the children. They couldn't even interact. So these children were legally and functionally orphans, even if their parents were alive and even if living in the same building. And that's really why, more than anything else, why the Irish hated the workhouse. It's not because they were afraid of work or that the workhouses were dismal. It was because to enter a workhouse was to lose your family. And we can imagine from that how hungry you would have to be to enter a workhouse with your family and then say goodbye forever to your spouse or to your children. Now that's what was happening to the Irish orphans, and the number of Irish orphans was growing every day by thousands during the Great Hunger. Now, at the same time this was all going on, there was another problem going on in the British Empire. And that is that there was an extreme shortage of labor and an extreme shortage of women in Australia. Now, Australia, was started by the British as penal colonies, Botany Bay, Van Diemen's Land, Norfolk Island. Prisoners were sent there from the British Isles for any sort of violation, large or small. The sentences typically were 10 or 20 years, but they actually were life sentences because the prison colonies were so brutal that most people didn't survive. But those who did survive stayed in Australia. They rarely returned to the British Isles. Now, since more men than women were prisoners, there were far more male than female ex-convicts in Australia at the time. And Australia is also huge. It's a continent. It's more than a colony or a country now. It's a continent, and it's huge. And it had lots of land. And this land wasn't all owned by English landlords as it is in the British Isles. And Australia also had still has many natural resources. And the industry then was mining, silver, copper, later gold. And mining towns sprung up all over Australia. Now, all of this attracted settlers from the British Isles. Farmers, ranchers, miners. And in the wild days of early Australia, most of these settlers were men. And the boom created an overall labor shortage, but in particular, there was a huge disparity between the number of men in Australia and the number of women. Now, for some officials in London, particularly Earl Grey, who was the British Secretary of State for the colonies, the solution was just too easy. We have a surplus of orphans in Ireland, half of which are female, and we have a shortage of women in Australia. So why don't we simply send the Irish Orphan Girls to Australia? Problem solved, they thought. And that's exactly what they did. Now, the workhouse were visited by officials. They asked for volunteers because they decided it was going to be a volunteer program. I'm not sure if these girls were old enough to volunteer for such a thing. They were mature enough for such a thing, but they asked them to volunteer. I'm not sure if these girls knew what Australia was, or where it was, or ever heard of it before. But the girls were living in a workhouse. They were apart from their families. They saw people come in the front door alive and out the back door dead to the mass graves. They saw that daily. So it wouldn't take much, I don't think, to induce some of these girls to volunteer. And over 4,000 did. Officially, I think the number was 4,175. And the British thought this was a humanitarian effort because they could not, in their limited imagination, think of any other way to help these orphans. So what happened? Well, the girls who volunteered were shipped to either Plymouth or Liverpool in England. There they boarded ocean-going vessels for the trip to Australia. They were given an allowance, which for them was a generous allowance, for the voyage. They were given 6 shifts, tops, blouses. They were given 2 flannel petticoats, 6 pair of stockings, 2 gowns, one of which was made of warm material. And their diet aboard the ship. In the workhouses, they ate milk and gruel was the typical fare. But aboard ship, they were given meat, beef, pork, vegetables, primarily peas, rice. And the better diet was really to ensure their good health for the voyage, but also so they would be employable and marriage-worthy when they arrived in Australia. Now, once in Australia, they were kept in barracks again. In Sydney, they were kept in the Hyde Park barracks, and the Hyde Park barracks was originally for prisoners coming to Australia. But the prisoners were elsewhere, and they moved the girls, the ones that arrived in Sydney. They moved to the barracks, and there they were trained as servants. The fine art of caring for a household. And then they were hired out as servants. And I saw an advertisement, for example, in an Australian newspaper in the 1849. And it was about a hiring room. And it was a place where prospective employers could come in to this hiring room at Hyde Park Barracks. They could meet the orphan girls and make arrangements for hiring one of them. And certainly it was billed a hiring room, but I think you can imagine it was more of a meat market than a hiring room. And keep in mind, these were peasant girls. They probably spent their short lives in Ireland without ever wearing shoes. They grew up in a hut which the family shared with a pig. They certainly didn't know, that the fork goes on the right, and the spoon goes on the left. In fact, I don't know that either. Maybe it's the other way around. And they had no special skills in polishing silver. They had to be trained for all of this in a short period of time in Australia. And the native language of these girls was Irish. And they had little or no English skills. In fact, most of them, from the records I've seen, were illiterate. The only English they knew was whatever they picked up, either on their trip from Ireland to England or from England to Australia. Now, we don't know much about these girls. There's a lot of government reports. There's written complaints filed by their employers, usually that they were too independent-minded or used bad language. An unhappy employer could simply discharge the girl, leaving her on the streets of whatever town she was in to fend for herself. But there's virtually no information from the girls themselves. There's no reports. No one bothered to interview them. There are no letters, no diaries, nothing to give us a real clue from their perspective of what life was like in Australia. Most of the girls were illiterate, and again, no one thought to talk to them. I tried, years ago when I was doing some research on this subject, I tried to find stories of these girls, and I found several interesting ones. I found girls from Dublin, and girls from County from Manor and Armagh and Westmeath, and they certainly came from everywhere in Ireland. I found some records of their employment in Australia. They were all hired as domestics. And I found a few arrest records for prostitution in a few cases, and theft, and I found an arrest record for indecent language, but not much else. But one can surmise, I think, what life must have been like for a 15-year-old girl in a workhouse, starving near death outside the workhouse. Once inside, she was fed the milk and gruel, but separated from her family. Indeed, if they were still alive, she was subjected to the harsh life of the workhouse. She saw dead being carried out to the back, to mass graves on a daily basis. She was shipped to England for transport. She was placed on board a ship for a 9,000-mile journey to the other side of the earth. And she was sent, to work as a stranger in a strange land. Eventually, and many of these, maybe most even, of these girls married Australian men. In fact, that was the point of the whole project. On average, they married at age 19, typically to a much older man. And life was harsh, particularly for those living in a remote farm or remote ranch or a mining town in Australia. And certainly there must have been, I hope there was, one of these girls who met a prince and lived happily ever after. But that was not likely the fate of most of them. Now, these girls were not universally welcomed in Australia, and part of that was anti-Catholic sentiment to the upper class and middle class Australians. They were untrained and immoral. I haven't got time to read the whole editorial, but I found an editorial in a Melbourne newspaper that I thought was fascinating. But I'll just read you a couple sentences. One is they talked about these girls as ignorant creatures whose knowledge of household duty barely reaches to distinguishing the inside from the outside of a potato, and whose chief employment heretofore has consisted of some intellectual occupation as occasionally trotting across the bog to fetch back a runaway pig. The same editorial talked about how they much preferred rosy-cheeked girls of England or the braw lassies of bonny Scotland to these scrawny girls from Ireland. Both of those comments are just classic cases of blaming the victim for their condition. Probably what we do today when we deal with these kids from Guatemala. It's their fault, or it's their parents' fault. If all of these kids had a PhD in microbiology, we'd welcome them, but they're just poor kids trying to escape oppression or poverty. So largely at the behest of the Australians, the program ended in 1850. It was only a 3-year program. It ended certainly not because of the scarcity of Irish orphans, which continued to be an issue in Ireland for decades. Because poverty and typhus and starvation continued well after the Hunger Years. And these girls were largely forgotten in Ireland and in Australia. And maybe it was due to the resurgence in genealogy in the last several decades of the 20th century, but more and more Australians were able to trace their ancestry to one of these orphan girls. And those descendants were instrumental in creating a monument in honor of the Australian orphan girls. It's the Irish Famine Memorial in Sydney, and it's located in front of the Hyde Park Barracks, which is very, very appropriate. And it has an open glass wall, and on that glass is engraved the names of these Irish orphan girls. The problem is, though, it has far too few names. I, in my limited research, found many, many names of Irish girls who were sent to Australia under this program, whose names are not on the wall. But that was the names they had, and that's the Irish Famine Memorial in Sydney. And I haven't been to Sydney, but someday I will, and I'll pay a visit to that memorial. And maybe someday we'll build a memorial in the United States with the names of the children from Guatemala and other parts of the world who have been held captive in our borders. But that's just yet another thought. But that's the story of the Irish Orphan Girls and their transportation to Australia because of the shortage of women in Australia. So that's it for this week. Please tune in to me next week as well. I haven't figured out what I'm going to talk about yet, but please tune in. Take a look at my website, clandonnell.net. Send me an email at clandonnell@gmail.com, and like and share my page on Facebook. And in the meantime, goodbye. Stay safe. Stay smart. And do the right thing. Goodbye.